This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome everyone here. Particularly, let me acknowledge the presence of Fred's wife, Angelique, and Fred's sons, Dominic and Zachary, who are back there somewhere. There you are. Look, and all the members of the Thompson family who are here, and we'll find out a little more about the Thompson family, it seems, this afternoon. This is one of the great events in a dean's life. These are the best of times for a dean, and they're the best of times for all of us at the Emory Law School community as we celebrate a colleague's achievements. The award of a chair is a sign to the world of the esteem in which we hold our colleagues and the esteem in which we hold Fred Tung. Fred really richly deserves this esteem. When I was considering the chair, I spoke to most of the leading scholars in the nation about Fred's work. To a person, they praised Fred's pathfinding scholarship and the incisive quality of that work. He is published in so many of the leading law reviews of the country. His scholarship is so timely that it's almost uncanny. For example, his work at the intersection of bankruptcy and corporate governance could not have been more perfectly attuned in an era when all of those issues are at the center of the world's economic systems. Talking about the world, Fred is not only a player on the national stage, he is a player on the international stage. In particular, he has close connections with China, having been there on a number of occasions, taught there. And for example, coming up here at Emory, we will have Chinese lawyers coming to find out what all of this business about bankruptcy is all about. And there can be no one better than Fred Tung to enlighten those lawyers as they assemble here later in the year at Emory Law School. Not only is Fred the great scholar, he's also the complete university and law school citizen. I've always heaped all these very heavy burdens on Fred. For 3 years, he was weighed under by the heavy load of the appointments committee. At last, he begged me, please, not another year on this, so I relented. But, of course, he does so much more. He advises the Bankruptcy Law Journal and its very good work, works with those bankruptcy law students in working on their notes. His teaching is quite outstanding. In fact, it was just last week I had a party at my home for students, and I ascertained in my backyard just how influential Fred is on his teaching. I was standing apart from this group talking, and I heard some reference to bow ties and great teaching. Now, as Fred knows, and the Tung family knows, that both Fred and I occasionally wear bow ties. We broke from that today. So I naturally thought it may be about me, and I broke away from one group, coming across to to think that they may have been praising my classroom performance. No, it wasn't me at all. It was Fred who they were talking about, and for about half an hour they couldn't stop praising Fred's work in the classroom. Large class, apparently handles it beautifully. All the work is very current, and he does just a marvellous job. So we couldn't have a better recipient of the chair. Let me say something about this chair. As I mentioned, we've got the Thompson family with us. It was Dean Woody Hunter who had powerful ways of persuading people, and he managed to convince Bob and Bob's brothers, Randall and David, to endow the chair in honour of Robert T. Thompson Sr. And you'll learn a little bit about Mr. Thompson Sr., but just to say briefly that he was the founder of the Thompson, Mann and Hudson firm in Greenville, South Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, and Washington, D.C. That was a firm that specialized in labor law, but Mr. Thompson's interests were broader, and when Woody Hunter was talking with Bob, I think he was able to persuade Bob that the chair ought to be a broad chair in business, recognizing Mr. Thompson's interest, particularly in Washington, D.C., in the business law area, and the law school's traditional strengths in business law. So we are delighted that so many members of the Thompson family are here, and I want to say that the Thompson family supports the school in so many ways. It was, as you walked in, if you walked in the bottom floor of the law school this afternoon, you would have seen some beautiful photographs on the walls. Those photographs were shot and given to the law school by Bobby Thompson, the class of 2008, a double eagle, I think, college and law school. So we're very proud of those photographs, and we're certainly pleased and really gratified with the support that the Thompson family over the years has given to the law school. So Bob, could I ask you to come up and intone a few words and tell us a little more? Thank you.
When David and I were talking about who should sit in this chair or professorship or seat, we called it different things. He finally called me. He said, "I'm excited. I thought of the perfect person, and it's Fred Tongue. Come have lunch with us." And I did, and I wrote my brothers immediately thereafter, and I said, "This guy's fantastic," and Angelique, his wife, is too. These are normal people, and my brothers are very skeptical types. They think that law professors don't have personalities or senses of humor, and so I assured them that both Fred was the exception to that rule, and just to make sure of this, yesterday I offered to slide him a few jokes if he needed something to convince everyone. But Fred is, I get the acid test came when, after all this was done, I was speaking to my son Bobby, who's now practicing out in California and couldn't join us, has a real job. It's wonderful. And after getting an LLM from UCLA in entertainment law, he said, "Professor Tongue, I was in all those committees with him. He's wonderful. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life." So that really, to us, is the acid test, because the critic, Robert Thompson III, gives you an A+. I'm delighted to be here. I was given a task by Susan Carter yesterday to talk about three things. One, what my father was like. Two, the family connection with Emory, which covers over 100 years now. And three, the purpose of the thinking that went into this chair professorship in 5 or 10 minutes. I've got to cover 100 years in 5 minutes. And if you notice that Susan waited until yesterday to tell me this, so I wouldn't have time to do what I might otherwise like to do. But first, let me introduce our clan, if you will. Starting from the left, this is my father's sister, my Aunt Frances Thompson Nichols, who came down from Charlotte, and her daughter, my favorite cousin, Nancy Holland. Next is my brother, Randy, and I will speak of his relative. He's a cardiologist in Kansas City, and I'll speak of his relative good health shortly. And his son, Adam, who's joined us from the University of Pennsylvania. Next is Marcia Ferguson, who's been part of the family forever. I worked for her and have for 30 years. We're just honored to have her. Next is my princess, Lacey Grace Thompson, who is 8, believe it or not. Next is our dearest friend, Dana Shepard from Atlanta. And next are Tweedledee and Tweedledum. We have Broughton Thompson and Grady Thompson, and with Catherine. And Catherine rounds out the crew. My brother David and his wife Karen couldn't make it. David works for a nonprofit on the Hill in Washington, and they're doing all sorts of funny, should I say, exciting things these days. Those are the 3 things. This is what my father used to look like. I vaguely remember this. My Aunt Frances and I last night were going through some of these pictures and laughing and having fun, and I told her what I had to talk about, and she said, well, you ought to do this and this. After about an hour's worth of things I should talk about, I figured I'd be here all day, but this is Fred's day, so I promise I won't. But some of them are fairly entertaining. One thing is interesting, I have a gift for David Bartlett here. Actually, I think I'm going to give it to Fred, because when my father was here and he did the combined college law school degree program, he was the very first editor-in-chief of the Emory's Journal of Public Law, as this slide shows, and volume 1, number 1, and this is it, which I found among his effects after he died in the year 2000. So I'm going to let you two share it, so you can put it in your archives. I don't know how many you have, but at least you have one. In here, it's interesting, to this article refers to some of the contributors. One of them, for instance, is William C. O'Kelly, who most of us know very fondly as Judge Bill O'Kelly, who has his good days and bad days, and I always like to be on his good days. He's served Emory well, and the Northern District, and rules Gainesville, and is just a great American. And there are a number of others. What I found interesting about this article that I found stuffed away somewhere was the prices of things in 1952. I just couldn't resist. A fan cost $39.64. A mattress pad cost $2.29. Can you imagine? Pillows, and not too bad. Folding chair, $2.64. But the prices amazed me. In 1950, my father and mother were married. His sweetheart, she was from Colquitt, Georgia. He was originally from Columbus. And everything that happens in Colquitt is put on the newspaper, and I like going through these things and pointing out to everyone how beautiful my mother was to listen to the response for what happened to you. So I've lived with that a long time. They were married, and this gentleman to the right of my father is my Uncle Henry, Aunt Frances's husband. She was pregnant and wasn't supposed to be there, but was there anyway, but ducked the picture. She told me last night. Now, one of the major things going on in the 1950s was baseball, and I emphasize that because our family is nuts about baseball. My mother never missed a Braves game. As we were growing up in the 50s, the only televisions in the beginning were here in Atlanta, and so our relatives, my grandfather here, Zachariah Abbey Cheshire on the right, and Henry Grady Cheshire on the left would come to Atlanta to watch the World Series. Uncle Grady on the left here, and there's more about that later, he was the first member of the group that we know of to go to Emory with two brothers, played minor league ball with the likes of Ty Cobb and Shoeless Joe Jackson and people like that. During the 50s, my father was very involved in the Georgia Bar Association. He was president of the Younger Lawyers section. One of his tasks, for instance, in the early 60s was to escort Dean Rusk, if you'll remember, the Secretary of State in the Kennedy administration, who came by our house and visited, and nice guy with all these protective. We wanted, the street thought we had done something wrong because all the cars were there. In the early 70s, he was elected to the board of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Now, not many people from this part of the country had been members of the board, and it was a significant development, and it will play into what this chair is all about. During the 50s and 60s, my father was involved in just about every major labor law, traditional labor law case that anyone has ever heard of that has studied it. This one was the Darlington Manufacturing Company. And it started sometime in the 50s, and he was brought in the late 50s, and it finally settled up in 1981. It put me through school and Randy and all the rest of our family, but it went on for 30 years practically. Also in the 70s, 60s, late 60s, early 70s, the Braves came to Atlanta. That was a milestone in the family, and the switching alliances from the Yankees to the Braves was tough, but somehow we survived. Now, besides Darlington, we settled the J.P. Stevens War. There was Daniel Construction Company. There was all these cases that are sort of monumental early labor law cases in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s with salting and things like that. But I had finished law school, had my own firm at the time, but we got together to work on what's called the so-called labor law reform. That was the effort by the unions to change the labor laws. It was a Democratic Congress and had been for a long time. Carter was president, and the unions were going to run this through. Just like 30 years later, Obama is president, it's a Democratic Congress, and we'll see what happens on those labor laws. The opponents were the Carter administration and the unions and their friends, and mostly small business, because large business didn't care or they had unions. So it was an interesting match between very, very strong unions and the administration versus basically small business. What was different about it was a massive grassroots campaign that really turned the labor law on its head. My father had been very involved with the National Labor Relations Board. This is Betty Southard Murphy, who was the first woman chairman of the board. And they did internal studies. It was a very well-run agency. This is him with several of the members. Far right was Doc Pinello, had been one of the funniest men alive. Far left was John Truesdale, who was either secretary or a member forever. And the one in the middle with my father is Howard Jenkins, who was on it for at least 100 years, I believe. Finally left in the Reagan administration. Well, to make a long story of that short, it started with the U.S. Chamber. That's Dick Lesher in the middle, who was chairman. And the question was, should federal legislation be passed making it easier to organize non-union employees? They gave speeches, and they developed allies, the major one of which was Orrin Hatch, who was a freshman senator from Utah. Now, everyone knows Orrin Hatch now. Maybe you listen to his CDs and his singing, or you listen to his eloquent arguments in the Senate. But he's been there ever since. He's always been a friend of ours. Another one, as you might be surprised to know, was Ted Kennedy. Now, a lot of people say a lot of things about Ted Kennedy, but we never knew him to be anything but absolutely cordial, delightful. I loved talking to him about sailing, and he was a great individual. We differed totally and completely philosophically, but personally, he was just absolutely delightful. And we would get together, and it'd be one of those, like, it's like almost like playing basketball, or baseball, where, oh, we got you on that one, or we got you on that one. It's that kind of cordiality and civility that I noticed that I thought was so important, and it was always so important in this process. Testifying, 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 constantly before Congress, going on television. This is Louis Nizer, who he didn't like us, as you can tell by the look on his face. With the unions, my father and Orrin Hatch, all over the country, meet the press. They would have these face-offs between senators. What ultimately happened, there were 7 filibuster votes, and they could not break the filibuster, and so the legislation was killed. That was the first time the unions had lost something ever. They made my father, they didn't have to make him, he probably all scowling when he wanted to, put him on the front cover of all these magazines. His career at that point had been under 3 of these 4 presidents. With Nixon, the wage and price control; with Carter, the labor law reform fight; with Jerry Ford, there was common-size picketing and other construction-related labor law issues in his time. And then there was Reagan, and everything completely changed. Now, he lived in Greenville, South Carolina, and the senator, it was Fritz Hollings and Strum, as he called himself, Thurman. And here, along with Senators Lugar and Warner and Hatch, through this victory party of my father, right after the labor law reform, was elected chairman of the U.S. Chamber, and all of this completely changed him in terms of his attitude towards small business. Previously, he had mainly represented big business. And he became a great believer in small business. Of course, this was obviously very similar to Ronald Reagan's attitudes, but one of the great perks that he received is spending a lot of time with the Reagans, going to parties, going to dances. Nancy Reagan would write notes. He even got to have dinner with the Sultan of Oman, now, who had a sword, who the Secret Service didn't like that at all, but nevertheless, they let him keep his sword. And he said, I don't worry about the Americans, I don't worry about the Russians, I just worry about the Chinese, which I was thinking about that today, sounding awfully interesting. After that was President Bush. Americans with Disabilities Act and other things came in then. And of course, his vice president was Dan Quayle. When I first saw this picture, I said to him, you look like you're talking to Dan Quayle. What were you saying to him? He said, I was giving him a spelling lesson. All right, that's essentially, very, very briefly, his career. I don't do it justice, but I want to hit the high points. The family I didn't know this until my son applied to Emory College, and I had to figure this out. My uncle Grady, Henry Grady Cheshire, who was named after, of course, Henry Grady, who was the writer and editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, was a great pioneer of the New South. And I think he was like the 11th or 12th child out of 13, my grandfather being the 13th, Abby Cheshire. At one point in the aughts, though, in the 19-aughts, Grady Cheshire, Zima, who is this gentleman on the lower left, and James Cheshire, who became a doctor, all went to Emory at Oxford. What we'd find later in the 70s is 3 Thompson brothers went to Emory, myself and Randy and my brother David. This is my Uncle Grady in the center, and because this said Sigma Nu, I cut that part off. On the right is Grady Cheshire, and on the left is Zachariah Abbey Cheshire, who they both had fought in World War I. This was such a fascinating picture. I brought it. I used to love listening to their stories about it. The next generation, James's daughter was named Aline, which I think is a beautiful name. And Aline married Hugh Besson, who had gone to Emory in the 40s. Ewell Besson. They lived just down the street here on the Clifton in a triplex. And he was the vice president of finance and treasurer for Emory forever, as long as I can remember. And then when they first introduced me to Emory, even though I had been born here, I'd been away a long time. They were just delightful when they were here. The next generation is my father. And then The fourth generation were my brothers and myself. Now, I know it's hard for some of you to believe, but that skinny guy in the middle is me. Now, I mentioned my brother's health. He's that skinny guy on the right, and he's still that skinny guy on the right. So sometimes fate is cruel. My son is, Bobby, as David pointed out, is a double legal, finished Emory College and law school. And these are the next generations. I figure I've raised 2 generations of hemorrhoids. Some of them try to be angels occasionally. Now, so we began with Grady Cheshire, and we began with Grady Thompson, who's sitting over there, my imp. This professorship began, Woody Hunter made it happen. The origins of it were with David Epstein, who was the dean before. And we had, at the time, I was chairman of the Alumni Fund, and we worked together on this. And I remember it sitting with my father at lunch at the Poinsett Club in Greenville, and I said, I think you need to have an eponymous chair or professorship at Emory Law School, your beloved Emory. And he quickly said, but that's your name too, which reminded us of that camp song, you know, John Jacob Jingleheimer Smith. We laughed about that and always did laugh about that. But we did it, and it's been fun ever since. And he agreed completely not to focus just on labor law, but because of that experience with small business, he wanted to focus on business and law. When he began his career, he came up with the name the Journal of Public Law in the beginning, and because he was convinced that the interaction between business and government was going to be very profound as the years go by. I doubt he would have ever predicted some of the profundities that we have seen recently. If I had told him yesterday that the president dismissed the chairman of General Motors, I think he never could have believed it. But it's very, very profound and significant, the interaction between public law and business, large and small. The rest of us were just here doing mundane things like visiting with Gorbachev as the Soviet Union dissolved. There were several, I'm going to give 2 or 3 of these and I'll quit. There are several things that my father wanted to make, and he'd write me these notes, wanted to make sure we were clear about on this professorship. This is my favorite. He said, I believe that the legal profession is the highest calling a person can pursue. The law establishes justice, civilizes societies, tames the beast within us, promotes reason over reaction, and enables humans to be free and safe, thus allowing us to pursue all that we are capable of achieving. That was his fundamental principles that he always lived by, and he said over and over and over again. In terms of practicing law, he said anyone can speak fancily. I don't know if that's a word or not, but it worked for him. If you can work around it, do so. Most people like plain language. A lawyer never hides behind fancy words. People know instantly that you have no idea what you're talking about. Civility, as I mentioned Teddy Kennedy. Civility in the legal profession starts with you. Some lawyers just cannot help themselves and are uncivil. To put it politely, you must not be one of them. Never stay away from a fight if the cause is just. He proved that time and time again. He loved a good fight. People are people. Never be manipulated and treat them like something other than people. And this really came more from his experiences in Washington. We do not have kings and queens in our country for a reason. I accused him of being a socialist, saying things like that one time, and he pointed me to the Federalist, and he was right. This was my favorite, and I didn't believe this till I'd done a few jury trials. I realized how right he was. You're not a real lawyer until you've tried a jury trial. There's something special about it that pulls everything together in your mind about what the legal profession is all about. And of course, the very important aspect, charge a reasonable fee and expect to be paid. And then, a fine businessman is a pleasure to represent, an honor to defend, the cornerstone of capitalism, and a delight when he pays their bills promptly. And then the advantages given to us as lawyers, as professionals, require us to contribute mightily to our society and our civilization. We must give back so there will be more for everyone. These are the basic principles, and this is one of the bases that we use to establish this professorship or chair. And finally, the law is a profession, not a craft. That's why we practice it for all of our careers. The higher calling we serve as lawyers is far more than just being officers of the court. All of us are the judicial process, and without our performing our jobs to the best of our ability, our system and way of life would be destroyed and anarchy would reign. And he would send me these little notes, and I'd say, did you get that from Oliver Wendell Holmes or Benjamin Cardozo or somebody like that? He said, no, it just struck me as the older I get, the more important I think these things are. Being civil, being professional, being excellent at what you do, being honest. And those are the type of things that stuck with me and how I remember him. Thank you.
Bob, thank you very much for those words. And Fred, could I ask you to step up and give us the lecture? Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Dean Bartlett, for your kind introduction, and thanks, Bob, for your remarks as well. I'm deeply honored to have been named the Robert T. Thompson Professor and to be standing before you all to deliver the Thompson Lecture. I'm really grateful to Bob and the Thompson family for your long-standing commitment to the law school and the university. My wife Angelique and I had the good fortune to have lunch with Bob a few months back, and we were talking about our families and where we'd come from and whatnot. And in the course of the conversation, it came out that there are something like 33 or 35 members of the Thompson clan that hold Emory degrees. And so the commitment of the Thompson clan to the law school and the university is truly amazing. And I'm thankful to be a beneficiary of that continuing commitment. I also want to thank my family, my wife Angelique, and my sons Dominic and Zachary for putting up with my work schedule and my travel schedule. I missed some soccer practices and some baseball games, and any of you with little ones at home, you know that when one spouse is out of town, the other spouse works 4 times as hard with the kids at home, and so thanks, sweetie. And thanks to all of you, my friends, my colleagues, and my students for your presence here this afternoon. Now, it's a propitious time to be discussing financial regulation. As a corporate and bankruptcy scholar, basically everything I read in the paper has something to do with something that I'm working on. I love reading the news in the morning, and I typically try to keep my newspaper reading to about 10 or 15 minutes. Otherwise, I could be lost in the news for a couple hours. But in the last year and a half, I've been able to justify reading the paper from cover to cover most mornings just because everything that's in the paper is related to something I'm doing. So for what I do as a researcher, it's an exciting time to be doing it. Now, there's surely a lot that one might want to talk about with regard to financial regulation and the financial crisis. My focus this afternoon is on executive compensation for bankers. And I'm not alone in this focus. Congress, the regulators, the G20 are all currently focused on ways to constrain executive pay packages to curb excessive risk-taking. So, for example, Congress, even in its initial TARP legislation, included provisions constraining managers' pay packages to avoid excessive risk-taking. The Federal Reserve has gotten into the act very recently. They proposed rules to give themselves a very broad oversight role over the composition of executive pay, again, to discourage excessive risk-taking. And finally, the G20 has recently adopted a set of principles encouraging the deferral of a fair portion of executives' pay, again, to incentivize managers to stay away from excessive risk. Now, in general, discussions of incentive pay, discussions of executive pay typically focus on how to structure equity and equity-based compensation arrangements. And of course, as most of us know, compensation of public company officers in the US is heavily focused on stock and stock-based compensation, and that includes bankers as well. And the basic idea with the stock-based compensation is we want to try to align managers' incentives with those of stockholders so that when stockholders do well, the managers also do well. With banks, though, this conventional approach might lead to excessive risk-taking, and I propose something different. I suggest that we could blunt managers' risk-taking incentives by paying them not just with the stock of their companies, but the publicly traded subordinated debt securities of their companies as well. Debt holders typically have more conservative tastes in terms of investment strategy than stockholders. Debt holders don't have the unlimited upside that stockholders have with respect to high-risk, potentially high-return projects that managers might choose. Debt holders, of course, get paid their promised interest payment and their principal repaid, so they're not excited about sort of the high-risk gambles. So if we require managers to hold some debt in their pay packages as well, maybe that might curb their risk-taking somewhat. And this idea of mine piggybacks on long-standing proposals to require banks to issue public subordinated debt in order to impose some market discipline on their risk-taking. And so one definitional note, when I use the term banker or manager, I'm referring to the top bank executives. All right, so let me just do a few things in the next few minutes. First, let me talk about banks and moral hazard. Let me explain why risk-taking is especially difficult to control with banks. Then I will recount the pay-for-performance movement that began in the 1990s and its influence on banker pay. Number three, I'll look at some plausible links between executive compensation and the financial crisis. And finally, I'll describe my ideas for a pay-for-less risky performance regime. All right, let's look at banks first. Now, banks are very special institutions. They're highly leveraged, which means they have very low equity capital relative to the amount of their liabilities or the amount of their assets. In addition, unlike most companies, the bank's assets and liabilities, they're mismatched. So their liabilities are primarily in the form of demand deposits. Highly volatile, highly liquid. The depositors expect that when they walk into the bank, they can get their money out whenever they want. And so in effect, the pool of the bank's major creditors can call their loans at any time. Now, on the other hand, the bank's assets are primarily in the form of loans, promised streams of payment from their borrowers. These assets are relatively illiquid. That is, it's not easy to turn them into cash on a moment's notice. Now, this mismatch between assets and liabilities, of course, leaves banks vulnerable to runs. So historically, when depositors got wind that maybe their bank was in trouble, they would all race to the bank to try to get their deposits out all at the same time. Now, of course, the bank doesn't hold all the cash, all the depositors' cash in the vault, and so it's impossible for the bank to honor all of these simultaneous demands for payment. And so the bank run ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, and even solvent banks might fail. Now, happily, we have deposit insurance to address this peculiar mismatch in the assets and the liabilities of banks. Deposit insurance generally prevents runs because most of us are pretty confident that the government will back all of the deposit liabilities of a failed bank. Now, deposit insurance has some nasty side effects, though. It gives bank managers a special incentive to take risk. Now, leverage, this sort of high amount of debt, that increases managers' appetite for risk, even for non-financial firms, because basically the firm is now gambling with the creditor's money. So managers who are faithfully representing the interest of stockholders are going to have incentive to take risky bets with that borrowed money. And with ordinary creditors, they understand this problem of risk-taking. So they contract for constraints on managers' risk-taking when they make their loans. In addition, excessive risk-taking by most companies increases their borrowing costs. But the bank's major creditors, the insured depositors, do not impose contract constraints on the bank or market constraints. They don't really care about the bank's risk-taking because their deposits are insured. So there aren't the same constraints on bank risk-taking that normally accompany borrowed money with other companies. Now, even as a bank approaches insolvency, absent some regulatory intervention, the bank can still borrow to keep making risky bets. All it has to do is raise its deposit interest rate by a little bit, and deposits will continue flowing into the bank. So, in effect, unlike other troubled firms, a troubled bank does not suffer the same liquidity constraints that capital markets typically impose on firms. Now, of course, deposit insurance doesn't eliminate a creditor. It just substitutes the government as a creditor of the bank. But government regulators don't have their own money on the line, and so they might not have the same efficient incentives to monitor the bank's risk-taking activity. So in this context, private market discipline might be a useful supplement to regulatory oversight. So I suggest we combine this private market discipline with internal governance incentives to improve risk regulation at the bank. All right, let me talk a little bit now about pay for performance and its effect on banker compensation. Now, standard pay for performance, again, attempts to align managers' incentives with those of stockholders so that when the shareholders do well, the managers do well also. Now, the pay for performance movement of the 90s led to dramatic increases in equity-based compensation. So during that decade, the percentage of executive comp that came in the form of incentive pay jumped from 37% to 55%. At the same time, there was an enormous increase in pay for performance sensitivity. Now, we typically measure that as the change in CEO wealth for every $1,000 change in shareholder wealth. And the pay for performance sensitivity increased by 10 times from 1980 to 1999. Now, we saw a parallel trend with pay for banker performance as well. It sort of coincided with a deregulatory trend from the mid-1970s through the 2000s. When the whole deregulation trend started, remember, in the 70s, banks, there was unit banking. Every bank had one branch in one state, and that was it. No interstate, no branching even within a state, let alone interstate banking. So over the course of a few decades, now we've got interstate banking, international banking. And as the deregulation of banks has proceeded, their executive compensation has also moved toward a sort of incentive-based pay model. And the basic explanation for this trend is that when an industry is tightly regulated, you don't really need incentive pay because the CEO's decisions can't affect the firm value all that much because of the constraints on growth from the regulation. As the deregulation proceeds, managers have more discretion, firms have more growth opportunities, and incentive pay makes more sense. Now, it's somewhat controversial as to whether overall pay for performance has been good for stockholders. For banks, the effect is potentially perverse. If we align bank managers' interests more closely with those of stockholders, we may be just exacerbating all the incentives that they have to take risk because of the various unique features of the bank. There's high leverage, there's lack of market constraints on risk-taking. We've already got that going on. And then when we add equity-based pay, that just adds fuel to the fire. It basically gives the bank managers the same unlimited upside to the returns from high-risk, potentially high-return bets that the stockholders like. And this is, of course, exactly the kind of strategy the regulators are trying to discourage. All right, so this is the background that brings us to the financial crisis. So what did banker pay look like immediately before the crisis? Can we blame the crisis, at least in part, on the structure of banker pay? Was banker pay a villain or ort just a scapegoat? All right, let's look at the world in, say, June of 2008. Now, in June of 2008, we're in this sort of pre-crisis lull period between the time when Bear Stearns collapsed in March of that year, and then in September, in that wild week in September, when the government seized Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, then they decided to let Lehman fail, so Lehman went into bankruptcy, and then they went and seized AIG, and this all happened in the space of 9 or 10 days. All right, so let's take a look at banker pay as of June 2008. And if we take that snapshot, we see that banker pay was actually pretty high in June of 2008. The highest paid CEO, bank CEO at that point was at Capital One. He was making $73 million on an annualized basis. In addition, among the top 24 largest bank holding companies, 10 of those CEOs were making over $10 million a year, and the average pay among them was over $13 million. In addition, their pay was quite sensitive to stock performance. On average, 61.4% of a CEO's compensation in that group was made up of incentive-based pay. In addition, for 18 of those 24 CEOs, over half their pay came in the form of incentive arrangements. All right, so now when we plot the relation between the bank CEO's total compensation and the percentage that's incentive compensation, we also see a nice tight correlation. Basically, the more incentive-based compensation you had, the higher was your compensation. And that makes some sense. Even in June of 2008, most banks were doing pretty well, so the more incentive pay you had, the greater was your total pay. All right, so what do we know then? Is banker pay the villain or maybe just a scapegoat? Well, one of the things that we can say about incentive pay is that it worked, sort of. According to one recent study, the CEOs of the biggest banks lost a ton of money. So on average, for 95 of the largest banks, the average CEO lost over $30 million in wealth. Losses ran as high as $370 million for at least one of the CEOs of the banks in the sample. In addition, so they had a lot of equity-based compensation, and they had a lot of stakes in their banks as well. 20 of the CEOs' stakes in this sample exceeded $100 million as of the end of 2006. So what can we say about this? Well, it looks like the CEOs were taking the big bets right along with their stockholders, and so when the stockholders lost money, the CEOs lost money as well. Now, does that mean that bankers are off the hook? Were there bad incentives involved or no? Well, one of the authors of the study that I just described suggests that these results show that banker pay could not have been a culprit. So a finance professor whose name I won't mention had this to say to the New York Times just about a week and a half ago. If the prospect of losing those amounts was insufficient to induce the firm's CEOs to pursue different policies, it's extremely difficult to imagine any compensation reform package that contains incentives that would do the trick. So think about that. It sounds plausible at first blush, but when you think about it, it seems to me it's a little bit facile. I mean, it shows some things, right? It shows that CEOs weren't trying to lose money, that they actually thought that the path their banks were taking was going to be a profitable path. But the fact that they ultimately lost money seems to me not to tell us much about whether they were in fact making risky bets or not. And at least in theory, the bank's equity-heavy compensation structures may have given the CEOs ample reason to take risky bets. Now, having said that, I'm not sure there's anything especially sinister in their pay arrangements. It's just the standard pay for performance that most firms are pursuing, except that with the banks, of course, the high leverage, the moral hazard that comes with deposit insurance makes conventional equity-based compensation especially hazardous. And so my proposal attempts to attack this problem head on. Basically, the idea is let's compensate managers with the publicly traded subordinated debt of their banks. So let me just talk about issuing public subordinated debt, this mandatory requirement, and then the possibility of paying bank managers with some of this debt. All right, so let's talk about subordinated debt. Now, independent of executive pay arrangements, a well-designed publicly traded subordinated debt requirement can align debt holders' incentives with the public interest in safe and sound banking. And this idea of requiring banks to issue public debt has been around for some time. Now, subordinated debt is going to be structured so that it's junior to the bank's deposit liabilities. So if a bank fails, subordinated debt holders don't get paid at all until all depositors are made whole. Now, the typical public debt holder is a sophisticated institutional investor. So those investors holding that public debt will discipline the bank in at least two ways. First, they're going to contract for covenants constraining risk-taking at the bank. And second, the market price of the subordinated debt is going to fluctuate with the bank's risk-taking. Because the debt is not insured and because it's subordinated to depositor liabilities, the market value of the debt is going to decline with excessive risk-taking by the bank. And again, because debt holders just don't get any more than their interest payments and their principal paid back, whether the bank's projects hit a home run or just hit singles. So the debt holders are going to prefer more conservative investment strategies than stockholders. All right. Important features of this public debt for purposes of imposing market discipline. First, probably we want to have debt that's medium to long term, say debt with maturity of 6, 8, 10 years. That way it gives the debt holders the time horizon similar to those of regulators. We want debt holders to want managers to make bets that are safe in the medium to long term. Also, what about periodic issuance? Probably we want them to be issuing securities continually, like maybe every 2 years, so that banks continually have to go to the capital markets to borrow money, and to the extent that they're taking excessive risk, the capital markets are going to punish them. All right. And finally, another nice feature about this requirement for public debt is it's imminently feasible. Many of the largest banks and bank holding companies already issue publicly traded subordinated debt. And so those are probably the institutions that we care about most in terms of systemic risk, in terms of preserving the government's deposit insurance fund. All right. Let me talk a little bit about paying with debt. We can combine our publicly traded subordinated debt strategy with a pay-for-performance strategy by including some of this debt in the manager's pay packages. As Jensen and Murphy famously claimed in 1990 in their famous article, it's not how much you pay, but how. Michael Jensen is a business school professor at Harvard, and Kevin Murphy is now in the business school at USC. Now, several studies have been done looking at the effects of CEOs holding debt in their companies, that effect on firm performance. And several of the studies look at CEO pensions. And a pension, of course, is a form of debt. It's an obligation of the company to pay an employee a fixed sum at a future date. Now, it turns out that the amount of CEO pension has some significant effects on CEOs' behavior. So one study showed that as the CEO's pension increases relative to the value of her equity holdings, that is, as her debt-equity ratio goes up, risk-taking goes down. By one measure, once the CEO's debt-equity ratio exceeds the debt-equity ratio of the firm, risk-taking goes down by anywhere from 0.3 to 0.4 standard deviations, which is economically and statistically significant. And so that's pensions. Subordinated debt is a much more direct incentive than pensions or salaries or other fixed payments because subordinated debt has a market price. Its value is going to fluctuate relatively promptly to reflect any excessive risk-taking on the part of the bank. Now, as with equity-based compensation, probably we want certain holding requirements, a vesting schedule for subordinated debt compensation as well. In addition, we probably want periodic sale opportunities for the officers holding this subordinated debt so that they'll have constant incentives to maintain a strong trading price for the sub-debt. So that's my proposal. I know I'm standing between you and a nice reception, so why don't I stop talking and let you ask a few questions? No, not him.
Yes. How did those institutions perform in the recent crisis compared to those that didn't have subordinated debt?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure that study's been done. I know that studies have shown that the risk premia that subordinated debt demands is affected by the amount of incentive, equity-based compensation that CEOs hold. So at least the trading price of the sub-debt responds to the CEO's incentives to take risk. That's what we know so far. Sure.
It seems that there's a possibility that if you adopt this compensation program, you remove all incentive to take risk and perhaps to innovate. So how do you balance those two things?
Okay, right. No, certainly the more debt you put in the pay package, I'm not suggesting we should eliminate equity-based compensation. And certainly as the debt equity mix gets more debt heavy, there is the possibility that we dampen risk-taking instead of suboptimal. That's absolutely right. On the other hand, and we don't really know empirically, we don't have good measures yet for exactly what's the right amount. Really, this idea of including debt in executive pay packages is relatively new. Folks are really just starting to write about it now. But let me describe a couple of sort of conceptual advantages to including some debt versus zero, some amount more than zero. One of the things it does is it decreases managers' incentives to shift risk, right? If they're wanting to hit home runs on behalf of shareholders, to the extent that the value of the subordinated debt drops as a result, it lessens the incentive to shift risk in favor of stockholders. Another important advantage is that the subordinated debt is still going to have some value when the company goes into distress. So unlike equity, where it may be an all or nothing proposition, once the company is close to insolvency, the sub-debt may have value that might incentivize managers to sort of stay in the game because they have some value at stake that's not equity-based. Yeah, Charlie?
Fred, when you looked at the capital structure of banks, there are equity holders who have substantial, as you put it, leverage because of the deposits. And I guess my question to you would be, if you make banks less risky, what's going to happen to equity investments in banks?
Oh, so
the other way of putting it is basically that the equity investor is not looking for a 2 or 3% return on a deposit, but is looking for substantially higher rates of returns over a longer time horizon,
right.
Knowing that it'll be a bumpier ride.
Right. No, but the reason I was thinking, so, but you started the question with equity holders or big depositors in banks too. Is that, but really, your question is just, who's going to invest, who's going to buy equity if the bankers aren't taking big risks? I mean, I think that's a concern. Banks are in competitive markets for talent, they're in competitive markets for capital, and certainly to the extent that you truncate the upside for investors, you run the risk that you're going to increase the equity capital costs of banks. I think that's right. The way I view, or a way that I view a plausible implementation of this approach is we could incorporate it as part of the existing regulatory structure. So for example, currently the Fed and the FDIC are supposed to calibrate deposit insurance premiums based on perceived riskiness at banks. It turns out that they're not really differentiating that very, very strictly among banks, but at least in theory, that's a plausible approach. You could tinker with capital requirements as well, and if we recognize that some mix of debt and equity could be useful in curbing risk-taking incentives, again, without, if we get it exactly right. In theory, we could use those regulatory incentives like how we calibrate deposit insurance or capital requirements based, at least in part, on the structure of the pay for executives at the bank. But I think you're right, it's not a magic bullet that has no costs. And the other problem, of course, is if it turns out that you think you're truncating the upside for managers, they'll go work somewhere else at an institution that's not regulated. That's clearly a possibility. John?
Actually sort of the flip of Charlie. So I guess I was wondering, you said that the debt holders are going to be sophisticated investors who are going to try to negotiate these limits on what the banks are doing, but presumably the equity holders in these banks are also sophisticated investors, not the depositors, but the equity holders. They should realize that the depositors don't have an incentive to do this. So I guess I'm not clear on why the equity holders wouldn't recognize this situation and either demand what you're suggesting themselves or otherwise arrange for protections if they wanted to. And I think my answer is similar to what Charlie's saying. They were along for the ride and they liked the upside. So, right. And what's the harm?
So why don't equity holders monitor the way that I claim debt holders would? Well, I mean, I think you answered it. They have different risk preferences, right? The equity holders want the big payday. They're well diversified. Typically also, the number of debt holders is typically smaller. The number of institutions that are in play, typically a smaller set than with equity holders, so that you actually might have better monitoring among the creditors because you have fewer collective action problems because it's a smaller set. But I agree, again, it's not, there are trade-offs, and I mean we could say, let's let the banks pick their own optimal debt equity mix, whatever they want to do, but then let's make the CEOs hold that too. And that way, at least, we're not necessarily imposing extra capital costs on the company while we're imposing discipline on the CEOs, or at least no more than we have to tinker with the CEO's pay package.
What we can do is pursue Fred to the reception outside and not let him off the hook, where we're going to grill him for another at least half hour. Fred, thank you very much. That was a wonderful. I do have one formal thing to do, which is to formally invest you, Fred, with the Robert T. Thompson Professorship in Business Law. Congratulations again. Bob, I think your dad would have been proud to witness this and to see Fred taking the chair that he so generously endowed. Thanks to all of the family for this, and please join all of us at the reception out in the Hunter Atrium just outside the doors. Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.